The coronavirus isn't just a health issue, it's an economic one as well. All around the world, shops, restaurants and factories have been forced to close to help fight the spread of the disease. Millions of jobs have been lost in retail, hospitality and even the industrial sector. Businesses are on the brink of collapse. In many countries, the powerful aviation and car sectors have turned to their governments for financial assistance. As corporate giants cry out for help, should taxpayers, themselves struggling, come to the rescue? Who will foot the bill for those massive government aid packages? The coronavirus looks set to make the world a poorer place, and governments face the daunting task of deciding who to prioritise. I'm Rob Watts in Berlin. It's nice to have you along with us. So, the economic crisis brought by coronavirus has driven businesses of all sizes, as well as individuals, to rely on governments to help them through. Even once proud corporations have found themselves begging for bailouts paid for by the state. With vast numbers of jobs dependent on the survival of businesses, some governments are now all that stands between their citizens and destitution.
A drive-through in the age of coronavirus. But rather than fast food, they're queuing for unemployment forms. Last month alone, more than 20 million people in America lost their jobs as lockdowns froze the economy. That has rapidly pushed many to the brink of poverty. Federal food bank programs such as this one in Las Vegas are helping people just about get by.
I'm still waiting on my unemployment. I've been waiting on unemployment like a month and a half.
In Europe, governments in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK and elsewhere across the continent have boosted income subsidies for workers laid off due to the pandemic, spending historically large sums in the process.
For all those who need assistance during this period, state aid for those not going to work and funding for companies will be extended and reinforced. Such measures have never been seen before, and they already protect more than 8 million employees and many of our companies.
Germany alone has already provided around 1.1 trillion in financial support, including loans of 50 billion to freelancers and small businesses alone. But the biggest tool of all available to governments is nationalization. When companies in critical sectors are on the brink, governments may step in and take a stake. For example, German airline Lufthansa has requested government intervention and some support may be forthcoming. There are limits to what a state can do by virtue of the fact that money is a finite resource. However, the pandemic has taught us so far that legally speaking, there's little to stop states doing whatever they feel is necessary.
Well, let's speak to Gabriel Felbermayr. He's an economist and president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Thanks a lot for joining us. Just explain to us how involved governments are actually even allowed to get in corporations.
So there are no formal limits that would forbid or prohibit countries or states to take shares in companies. There is rules, of course, on the European level that regulate state aid, but there is no such thing as a prohibition to do so. There are a lot of corporations where states are involved in, from utilities, electricity producing companies, to the airline companies, to railroads, postal services, and so on. So we already have many sectors in many countries where states own a lot of equity.
You mentioned airlines and you mentioned Europe. There's been some pushback from other airlines against France's decision to help support Air France KLM. What are the arguments against the state getting involved with companies?
Look, in the last months and years, we had a lot of discussion around China and China subsidizing Chinese companies who would then compete internationally and skew the playing field in their favor. And exactly the same arguments are now brought towards state interventions in Europe. If France or Germany or any other country subsidizes its own airline, there's a risk that this leads to a an uneven playing field and disadvantages competitors like Ryanair or others who don't have the support of a state, because state aid will at the end influence the borrowing costs of those companies. It will also possibly influence the valuation of those companies on the stock exchanges.
But this money isn't coming without strings attached. There are conditions on a lot of these bailouts. What sort of things are the governments pushing for from companies in return for the money?
Well, essentially two things that governments tend to insist on in Europe. First, management must forego bonus payments during the time that the governments are invested in their companies, and the companies are not allowed to pay any dividends. These are the rules that are most often required, and then there are, in many cases, also government delegates on the boards of these companies, so that states reserve the right to influence management decisions in the companies that they invest in.
So is this good news for taxpayers? Do they benefit from their tax dollars going into these major corporations?
This is a very hard question. So, economic history is very skeptical about that. In the past, governments that played a big role in corporations typically didn't do very well. The states are not the better entrepreneurs. But in the current crisis, if a company like Lufthansa or Air France goes bust or needs to be restructured, this could lead to bigger costs for the taxpayer than if governments invest in a temporary fashion. It must be very clear that governments should get out of these investments as soon as they can. European Commission is talking about 6 years. This is already very generous. But in the long run, clearly, government money invested in those corporations is typically not well invested. In the short run, there might be benefits for the taxpayers.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us your expertise on this. Professor Gabriel Felbermayr, President of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy.
Thank you, Rob.
Now, it's that part of the programme where you get to ask your questions to our highly knowledgeable science correspondent, Derek Williams.
If you can get the virus through your eyes, how does it reach your lungs to infect them?
This is interesting because we've been hearing from the beginning that the eyes are one possible avenue for the coronavirus to enter your body, but it's still not one that we know much about. A couple of new studies, however, appear to confirm that the eyes can serve as an entry point for SARS-CoV-2, as well as a reservoir for person-to-person transmission. They showed that some cells in the eye also carry the receptor that the virus binds to. It's called ACE2. That's the enzyme doorway the virus uses to enter and attack the body. And there are tiny ducts between the eyes and the sinuses, and tears drain into your nose. So an infection in the eye could move from there to your upper respiratory tract and eventually make its way to your lungs.
Why is diarrhea a symptom for the virus?
Gastrointestinal problems like loss of appetite, nausea, and diarrhea are also fairly common symptoms for COVID-19. In fact, there are some indications that gastrointestinal complaints can be among the first symptoms to appear in some people who catch the coronavirus, and that in some people they'll be the only complaint. As to the question of why, the general consensus appears to be that the ACE2 receptor, that doorway into your cells that I mentioned in the last question, that it isn't just very plentiful in cells in the lungs, but also in the gastrointestinal tract. So most experts think that makes the organs that make up the gastrointestinal tract, particularly the small intestine, quite susceptible to infection as well.
What mechanism determines patient symptoms? Why is there this great variation in symptoms in different people?
Some people are asymptomatic, others develop life-threatening pneumonia, some only get diarrhea, others have neurological problems. Some experts even think it's associated with lesions on the feet, a condition that's being called COVID toe. At times, it really does seem like we're not facing a single new virus, but a host of them that all cause different symptoms. We still don't know exactly why COVID-19 can affect different people in such different ways, but a few factors definitely play key roles. Two big ones are how old you are and whether you have previously existing conditions. Another factor is your sex. Then there's your blood type. It could play a role. And factors that are more nebulous, like whether you might have had certain vaccinations. And of course, there's your own individual genetic makeup, which lies at the heart of everyone's personal immune response. So there are a lot of things that will be playing a role in symptom variation in COVID-19 patients. Although there are, of course, going to be trends and similarities in symptoms if you look at large groups of patients. At the individual level, people just don't react to infections in identical ways.
That's our science correspondent, Derek Williams. If you have got a question, do get in touch with us. You can leave it as a comment or a post on our YouTube channel. Now, to be eligible for state aid, the state needs to know that you exist. But for the around 2 billion people around the world working in the so-called informal economy, that isn't the case. Businesses that aren't registered for taxes or monitored in any way at a government level are not in line for the sort of support formal enterprises are getting, as we've been hearing. The International Labour Organization has warned relative poverty among informal workers could increase more than 50% worldwide because of the pandemic. Some of them are having to work through the crisis despite the risks to their health. And that's why governments are being urged to at least ensure they have access to healthcare and food support for their families.